started. I have a feeling this is going to be a really rich discussion, so it's wonderful to have you all here. My name is Nada Zafti. I'm the director of OpenGov Hub, and we're really excited to have you for today's discussion about modernizing Congress. Of course, the broader context for our conversation is, some real crises going on in the world and in our political system. Of course, the ongoing pandemic, as well as really the political crisis that, we continue to be reminded of, obviously with January 6th, but also just kind of congressional gridlock and other major challenges. So in the midst of all these challenges, though, there are some interesting reforms happening behind the scenes in terms of modernizing Congress and bringing it to the 21st century. So that's what we're really excited to learn about today from three amazing speakers and experts on this topic. And also, this is a good chance for us to give feedback on some new research and their emerging work on this topic. So again, if you're just joining us, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. I'll take a second now to introduce our speakers and format. So our main presenter for today is Lorelei Kelly, who is a longtime friend of the OpenGov Hub, and I think really one of the very best people to be speaking to us on what's happening in Congress behind the scenes in terms of kind of information infrastructure and public engagement. Lorelei is a fellow at the Beeck Center at Georgetown University, Beeck Center for Social Impact and Innovation, and she'll be presenting for about 10-12 minutes about some of this new research. And then we will take 10 minutes to hear from our two discussants today, which include Marcy Harris, who's the CEO and co-founder of PopVox, which is a technology platform, neutral and nonpartisan platform to really promote civic engagement and public participation in the governing process. And then we'll be hearing from Dr. LaShonda Brenson, who is the Senior Fellow for Diversity and Inclusion at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, where she leads the center's efforts around congressional staff diversity and other topics. So I encourage you to check out everyone's bios because these are three incredibly impressive speakers and we're really delighted to learn from them today. Again, we will hear from Lorelei for about 10-12 minutes, about 10 minutes from our two discussants. And then that will leave a good amount of time, 20 minutes or so for Q&A before we close today's brown bag. So again, introduce yourself in the chat if you haven't had a chance to. And without further ado, I will hand it to Lorelei.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, great. All good.
I'm really excited for the conversation, mostly with this group. I love OpenGov Hub and was at the inaugural event when it opened up a number of years ago now. So thank you for attending today. What I want to do is set the stage for what modernization in Congress means, because I think a lot of folks think that somehow, because it's the most powerful legislature in the world, that it is a modern workplace and that people have things like apps and Zoom or something other than a 3-ring binder and an intern to deliver a message across the hill. So what's happened in the last 4 years in Congress with the Select Committee on Modernization is the result of a couple of decades of work of looking at what has happened to this institution, where are the gaps, and how the institution itself needs to take a stand and step forward and start fixing itself. So every 20 years since the end of World War II in the 40s, Congress has convened a select committee to reform itself. So there was one in the 40s, there was one in the 60s, there was another one in the 70s, and then there was one in 1992. And really the only time any of the implementation or laws have changed from those reform efforts was from the 70s. So we're looking at a Congress today that has been just mired in sort of backwardness and arrested development, really is the best way to put it, to the point where certainly over the last decade, it's become an institution from the outside that is intellectually incapacitated, physically disconnected, and technologically obsolete. Again, this is an organization that still to this day uses metal file cabinets, 3-ring binders, and in keeping with the theme of our presentation today, which is contested institution, a continuity of the institution, and maybe even a collaborative institution. I don't think I need to talk too much about what's happened just in the last year and a half with the pandemic, which forced Congress to adapt electronically and adapt to modern workflow, probably more than anything else in the last 100 years. And then contested in the sense that January 6th has so many implications for how we need to conceive of democracy moving forward. Not only do we obviously, as a legislature, not have the consent of the governed, the legitimacy of the institution really is plummeted. It's less popular than almost any other institution in American society. And it's at the point now where the actual continuity of American government is at stake, because Congress is the first branch of government. Yet, if you look back again over time, it has ceded its powers to the executive branch for years, to the point where this sort of three-legged stool, the Supreme Court, or the courts, the executive branch, the president, the agencies, and Congress, it's a really wobbly stool. And Article 1 is another one of the parts of the Select Committee on Modernization that it has taken up, is like, how do we give the People's House, especially the first branch of government, back some more of its authority and power? So it has many, many different layers and themes. The first year of the committee, it started in 2019. Nancy Pelosi actually created it as 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans. It was out the gate in 2019. It stood up, and within that first year, it passed a resolution that was not only bipartisan, it was unanimous with the 6 Democrats and the Republicans on the committee. And they came up with 97 recommendations that first year. And the first recommendations were things like human resources, accessibility, staff capacity, things like paying interns, reforming the budget process, looking at technology and transparency. But I think my favorite thing about this committee, and you can see some details, I wrote a piece called Push Forward Now, which I'll put in the chat on my site at Georgetown, was that the committee from the very beginning was about listening and inclusion inside the institution. So not only was it unanimously bipartisan on its first year of recommendations, it also, one of the first hearings that it did was called a Member Day hearing, which was to open up the mandate and the agenda of the committee to all the members of Congress. And I think something like 35, or Marcy, can you help me out? Like how many members testified that first day? It was a tremendous number of members who were allowed to come in and say what their top priority. It was a lot in Congress, and they really incorporated a lot of that from their own peers into the agenda. So the committee kept rolling right through the pandemic. It had already socialized a lot of members on the importance of modern technology. So let me just give you another example. Like, the document format of Congress is from the Civil War era. It's just a couple decades past hot lead type. It doesn't have any kind of a unified bulk purchasing opportunity for things like an iTunes store for Congress. All of the things that we enjoy and expect in the outside world just were not available to these members. And I'll just wrap up by saying, over the course of even the pandemic, it helped move Congress online. It had already demonstrated it, started doing its hearings online. And keep in mind, when Congress adopted remote technology and its rules in May of 2020 to adapt to the pandemic conditions and health and safety, it created a Congress where the whole United States could be a potential witness in a committee hearing. That, plus it created an electronic workflow to submit documents. Again, this doesn't seem like track changes or collaborative editing or Google Drive. Seems like something that we all do all the time as an instinct. It is absolutely not. It was almost sort of a workflow revolution in Congress. And we're still looking at what are the implications of that to strengthen democracy. Data, technology, evidence-based decision-making, it's all out there. Congress, or the Modernization Committee, just recently passed another couple set of recommendations. So it's up to, I think, 140 now, and it's got one more year to roll them out and start implementing them. And that's what I hope we can talk about, is the collaborative aspect in this discussion today, is how do we make sure that this is something that lasts and that we continue, continue emerging with new ideas and new proofs of concept and pushing it out now that Congress itself has taken a stand. So thanks. I'm going to stop there so we can get to discussion.
Well, very good. Thank you so much, Lorelei. So yeah, that was short and sweet. I'm sure there will be lots of questions and feedback as well. So again, feel free to start sharing questions or comments in the chat as they come to you. But we'll turn next to Marcy, if you want to just share, about 5 minutes kind of reactions and what are you seeing from your vantage point, and then from LaShonda after that.
Great. Thank you so much. And let's see if I can share my screen. I will share just one slide. This actually came from a talk that Lorelei and I worked on just before the pandemic that we actually gave in person at Georgetown, talking about the 5 reasons that Congress has historically reformed itself. And I think if you look at these, you will notice that many of these are currently present. So it really was kind of, the time was ripe for the modernization effort, even before the craziness of the past several years. So just to go over those, the previous reasons for reform have been to maintain and protect the co-equal status in relation to the executive branch, as Lorelei mentioned. We saw a lot of this after Watergate. To address institutional abuses and answer public demands for openness and accountability. The various transparency initiatives that have happened over the years, but also including things like bringing Congress into the TV era with C-SPAN and making legislative data available, which Kirsten Gullickson, who's on this call, has been very involved with. Number 3, to increase capacity to address complex issues. That really speaks to the need for expert staff, which you've, I'm sure, heard the discussion about staff turnover in Congress, the limits on staff pay, which makes it very difficult to compete with the private sector or even other branches. 4, to operate more effectively and efficiently. This really gets into many of the tech questions that Lorelei mentioned. And 5, to respond to security issues or emergencies. This was originally on the list because of anthrax. There's a lot of documentation from that time that showed that after September 11th and the anthrax attacks, offices finally embrace things like email and being able to update their websites remotely. But of course, then we saw the accelerant of COVID over the past 2 years that has really opened the doors to Congress operating remotely and accepting, as Lorelei mentioned, digital submission of bills, remarks, and co-sponsorships, which again, Kirsten led the charge to make that possible in the House. I think it went live about 48 hours after being announced. So for those of us who've been watching Congress for the past decade, moving at that speed on an initiative like that was absolute light speed. It was like 10 years of progress within 2 days. So, in many cases, what has happened, at least technically during COVID, has proven that what we knew all along, which is that the limitations on modernization in many cases in Congress were never a question of technology. It was often and always a question of culture, will, sometimes funding, sometimes competing authorities, and who actually has the ability to make the call and how can they coordinate among various offices that themselves can't tell each other what to do. So the interesting thing about Congress is, the cliche that it's set up as 541 small businesses. And also when you get to the officials and the officers, it's not really that the speaker tells them what to do or that they can tell each other what to do or that they can hold each other accountable. There's really a need to kind of build consensus that something needs to happen and work more in a coordinating and collaborating way as opposed to a top-down structure, which can be very frustrating, especially when you're looking at technology. Lots of this stuff we could talk about for ages. I know Lorelei asked me to speak more specifically to some of the opportunities for public engagement that have come out of innovations these past couple of years, and some of it related to the Modernization Committee's recommendations. The first one that I'll mention, I would say it doesn't come directly out of the Modernization Committee's recommendation, but they have referenced it as something that other offices and committees can learn from. And that is what we saw the Natural Resources Committee do with their environmental justice legislation, which, for those of you who are familiar with the environmental justice topic, one of the principles of EJ is that no one speaks for the communities and the people in impacted communities, they speak for themselves, which doesn't usually fit very well into our legislative ecosystem in the way that things normally work in Congress with advocacy groups and lobbyists and so forth. So this really was an effort led by the Natural Resources Chairman Raul Grijalva with Representative Don McEachin. And they launched a process that been watching Congress for a long time. I've never seen anything like this. It kicked off with an in-person event where representatives from around the country were invited to the Capitol. You can tell this was in 2019, wouldn't be possible right now, but maybe in the future. They also had an online component. But at that event, they had not yet written the bill they were calling people to talk about. Instead, they introduced a list of principles and invited people to weigh in on the list of principles that they would be using to guide their work on this bill. And I usually use the analogy of baking a cake. Often the public input process is, we made a cake, come tell us if you like it, taste the cake. And this was really a process of saying, we think we'd like to make a cake. Should we make a cake? What kind of cake should we make? What should the ingredients be? So it was really bringing people in much earlier in the process in a way that I think was really groundbreaking. We at PopVox helped with posting the list of principles, and then the committee got input from lawmakers. So you see here, members of the committee posted their own statements on that list of principles. Let's see. Sorry, this is how it worked. You don't need all the weeds. And input from organizations. So organizations were able to post their statements and what they liked and didn't like, and then also from individuals, so they could post their input on the list of principles. And then all of that, the staff actually took the input that they got at that RFI stage, the request for information, and they incorporated it into the bill language, which they then posted on this platform that we hosted called Madison, that allowed line by line input on the bill text. And for those of you who've been in the open government space for a long time, I just want to give credit for Madison to the Open Government, the OpenGov Foundation, which is no longer active, but they built Madison as an open source project, which we then used to host and kind of updated the code. And the committee ended up getting over 360 substantive inline comments on the bill draft, which they then incorporated into the final bill text. They introduced it. They again had it on PopVox to receive input on the bill, and then introduced all that they had received throughout that process into the record at markup. So it really was a very interesting process that, again, I think was very groundbreaking. And I know I'm going a bit over time. I just want to mention one other thing that does relate to the Modernization Committee's recommendations, which was the reintroduction this past year of congressionally directed spending, which many of you probably know as earmarks. And I know that many in the transparency community were not fans of earmarks back in the day. There was a recommendation that this ability for members of Congress to direct spending be reintroduced with some significant reforms, including that the members had to make their request public. They prioritized 10 selections. There was a preference for those that showed community support. Only for-profit entities or governments were eligible. And GAO is going to audit enacted requests in the future. This was really groundbreaking, and it was kind of part of Congress working to take back some of its Article 1 power to have more say in how funds are directed. It was also implemented very quickly, so a lot of offices didn't have a chance to set up a really elaborate process for it, but there were some standouts, including Senators Coons and Graham, who had, they really doubled down on community information about how this process works and what's possible. And then Representative Mike Simpson he's laid out a roadmap for how this is going to happen in the future, trying to train organizations in his district to be able to participate. And really one of the standouts was Representative Pappas, who created a community advisory board for evaluating the earmark requests, solicited public comment from his district on the request that he received, and allowed the community advisory board to weigh in on the final decision of what he recommended. With a little bit more time in the future, if this is allowed to go forward next year, we think that there's really an opportunity to see more engagement and people connected more to what Congress is actually doing with that program. So I'll stop. There's a lot more to talk about, more to be done.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Marcy. I'm sorry, Isabella.
Oh, no, go ahead. LaShonda.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm LaShonda Brinson. I'm with the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. I lead our congressional staff diversity work. And as it relates to modernizing Congress and thinking about diversity, I think it's important to think about the growing number of diverse Americans and how that lack of transparency and lack of diversity within the congressional staff really has an impact in the way that we might look at policy and helping. And a lot of the recommendations that the select committee made was specifically directed at staff. And one of them being to make the Office of Diversity and Inclusion in the House of Representatives, for example, permanent, as well as other recommendations, while not specific to staff of color, will disproportionately impact and hopefully lead to a greater number of diverse candidates to go onto the Hill to senior positions. So at the Joint Center, what I focus on, my research is looking at the lack of transparency that Congress has in terms of being transparent to what extent the diversity of their staff exists. While federal law requires disclosure of employees' demographic data by many federal agencies and private companies, Congress, however, themselves does not provide this information, even though they're supposed to be representative of all citizens. And so the work that we do helps to shine light on that lack of transparency by providing data and charts to underscore the lack of diversity in senior positions. And for example, our research reveals that top staffers in the US Congress are overwhelmingly white, even though the nation is becoming increasingly diverse. And when we say top positions, we study specifically Chief of Staff, Legislative Director, and Communications Director, both in the House and the Senate. And while recent Congresses has reached new heights when it comes to diversity and inclusion amongst members, members of Congress are still overwhelmingly white when compared to the overall population. While people of color account for 40% of the US population, they only account for 26% of US House members and only 11% of US senators. And then if we look at the staffers, that could be an opportunity, right, to fill in some of those gaps in terms of the lack of diversity already amongst the membership in terms of senators and representatives, but there's still a significant lack of diversity amongst top staff. If we look at the Senate, there's only about 11% of people of color represented in these top positions in the Senate, and a little bit more in the House, but most of those people are employed by the Congressional Black Caucus or other minority members in Congress. And so we think about how Congress can modernize itself to attract a more diverse staff population. That I think is crucial to the types of legislation and policies that are under consideration. For example, Congress needs to think about how they can create a hub of HR to health offices and how they hire employees. That helps to contribute to lack of diversity, because some of the offices, they have a hard time recruiting diverse candidates because they rely only on the people within their office to recruit staff and interns. And so, for example, if they can have more technology in ways that they can do a broader outreach to minority-centered institutions, including historically Black colleges and universities, as well as other minority-serving institutions that can allow for a greater pipeline for more diverse candidates and interns, but also in higher level positions. So that's one of the ways that Congress can modernize itself to attract more candidates. And that's part of the recommendation in terms of making the House office more permanent. That's some of the efforts that they're trying to do in the House Diversity Office. And then also the Senate has a Senate Diversity Office, but it's for the Democratic caucus. The Republicans, while they're in the Senate, while they're working on diversity issues, they don't have a public-facing office. And so one of the ways that they can also modernize on the Senate side is to develop, similarly to the House office, develop a bipartisan office on the Senate that will communicate to the American people that the institution can present a bipartisan front when it comes to trying to address the issues of diversity and inclusion, as well as show like what the House Modernization Committee is bipartisan. So like I think something on the Senate side could be helpful to communicate that as well in terms of focusing on broader on what the Senate can do, but specifically as it relates to diversity, establishing an office like that could help senators recruit more diverse staff as an example in terms of recommendation. But that's all I had. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I think we can see a few questions in the chat, and one is from Benjamin, who might still be on. But essentially, there's a lot of discussion returning to power of Congress, but given the large and complex regulatory state we have, the evident dysfunction of highly polarized Congress, and Congress's willingness or eagerness to effectively delegate to executive branch, how can we return power to Congress and still have a functioning government? And I will direct this question to anyone from the speakers, but maybe starting with Lorelei.
Thanks for your question. Yeah, I mean, this whole issue of being able to handle complexity is a huge problem in Congress, because I think one of the things that the last 18 months of sort of crisis has helped people understand is that Congress is not a top-down streamlined organization. It's not a parliament, in other words. Like it's a bespoke complex machine that is unlike anything else in the world at a national level. So it's this very powerful, it controls sort of all the money originates in the House. And when I say modernization, I've been talking about the House of Representatives. LaShonda touched on the Senate a little bit, but really the genesis and the activity on this so far has been in the House, not in the Senate. We're hoping to reel in the Senate. One of the things that I think, and Marcy can also address this too, is one of the things we can do to rebuild legitimacy and empower Congress is to figure out where does data and evidence as a participatory activity fit into rebuilding its legitimacy. I don't think there's a trade-off right now between improving the reservoir of knowledge and lived experience, for example, is another piece of this. I don't think that there's a trade-off from that. I think that you can do both. I think right now we can build legitimacy and have better knowledge, and you can do things in meetings like dynamic modeling of data. You could curate the information through Congress's own rules, which would in a committee be the oversight plan and the seniority of the members. There are ways to bring in far more participants into congressional activity given the far more complex data-rich world that we're living in. I think, you know, I look at it as a terms of use for a modern legislature and rules of engagement for who participates in that. And I think Congress is gonna have to stand up and say, these are the terms of use for data and evidence. And it echoes the muscle memory of the rules we have in place. They're hundreds of years old, but we're gonna use new tools for doing this now. And that alone would be tremendous in rebuilding sort of legitimacy in the sense that it's representative of actual people in 441 districts across the country. I don't know, Marcy, do you want to add to that? Because I know you've thought so much about oversight functions, evaluation and monitoring with things like citizen science and civic generated data.
Yeah, well, and I would also say, I think the way that Benjamin phrased the question is it really covers so much and could be a day-long conference to discuss, because I mean, he's right. If you want to talk about bringing more power back to Article 1, to the people's branch, and then it's completely gridlocked and you can't get a vote, that's not a very successful way to govern. And so I have made the case to some people who argue that we should get rid of Chevron deference in the federal agency. I'm like, well, you can't argue that and say you're not going to reform the filibuster, but that is a totally different conversation. But I do think that the question of how Congress reclaims its role is wrapped up in the capacity issue, is wrapped up in the technology and expertise issue, but also, as Lorelei pointed out, the evidence-based policy reforms that are happening now in the executive branch. When Congress passed the bipartisan bill to kick off the evidence-based policymaking practices in the executive branch, it didn't give itself similar authority, resources, or directives. So it punted evidence-based policymaking to the executive branch. There's recent discussion, and one of the recommendations, the latest recommendations of the Modernization Committee, is to set up essentially a similar commission for the legislative branch that would begin to make recommendations on how Congress itself can incorporate evidence-based and data-driven practices into the lawmaking and oversight process. I think that that's huge and is the future of legislating. I think we probably need a body that is either a revised Congressional Budget Office that's more broad, that looks at policy modeling more broadly, or a separate agency that looks at policy modeling more broadly for the legislative branch. But I think that's the future of legislating, and I think a truly modern Congress will write laws differently, in that it will set the parameters for what the law is supposed to do and the metrics by which it will be measured, but allow much greater flexibility both in the executive branch and at the local implementation level, so that as laws are implemented, they can learn from each other, be improved. You can monitor for outliers, and kind of have a continuous improvement cycle. But this is why the modernization process needs to continue, because there are so many things still on the list that have not yet been addressed.
Thank you.
Do you have anything that you wanted to add to that in terms of Congress handling complexity and bringing legitimacy back so that it actually works? That's going to be key. If it can't deliver, then a lot of this won't matter to people back home in their living rooms.
Just would add, just kind of underscoring the importance of the Select Committee on Modernization, right? A lot of members of Congress, unfortunately, in terms of their election or re-election, they campaign on the fact that Congress itself is dysfunction. So they're kind of, really rooted and supportive of that view of Congress, because it helps in their re-election, and then they become a part of the problem if you believe the story that they're telling when they're trying to get reelected. And so having more people invested and know about the great work that the Select Committee on Modernization is doing, I think can help. But I think it's so hard, because I feel a lot, unfortunately, members of Congress are kind of invested in that view of Congress because it helps them in their re-election campaigns. And so I think that creates this great complexity in terms of how you move Congress forward to make it so that it is more functional and modernized, so they can deal with more complex issues.
Okay, thank you. I have a follow-up question in the chat from Netta. So she's asking if the pandemic got Congress to accept expert testimonies remotely, can that actually increase the chance of getting more diverse voices in front of legislators? And secondly, picking up on something that was said earlier about participatory budgeting, possibly with a chance to basically have a community advisory board to help earmark funds, and how can that be more diversified?
I will say, to answer the first part, that they actually have been allowing people to testify virtually, and that has led to greater diverse voices, and there's a movement from the Congressional Hispanic Caucus has actually been measuring the extent to which there's diversity in terms of expert witness requests, but I don't think they've published anything publicly yet, but I know it's something that they're looking and studying to see to what extent that there's diverse voices at the table. And because of there's been a noticeable increase in terms of the diversity of expert witnesses, there's a movement to try to see if there's a way to make that part in terms of expert witness testimony more permanent, right? Because not everybody can afford to come to DC and take off time from work and travel to DC. So I know that there is a movement to make that aspect permanent on the Hill.
Well, and I would just add to what LaShonda said, absolutely. It does seem that there is some discomfort with continuing remote hearings, at least on the part of some, because they feel that members should be in person, and that that contributes to comedy and relations across the aisle. I think that they may still be allowed in certain circumstances, but I have not heard anyone who wants to go back to not allowing remote witnesses. It really does seem like there's universal acceptance that that is a net good thing. And I don't know how many folks know that for anyone who has testified in the past, for the most part, they were covering their own costs to come to DC, or some organization was covering. Congress doesn't pay for that. So it created a terrible barrier to entry for those who had important things to say and wanted to be a part of the process. For open gov and data nerds, there's a really important piece there on witness diversity where advances could be made, which is that we don't currently record demographic information of witnesses. So LaShonda's organization does amazing work in looking back and piecing together data from crazy sources, but that's one of the areas where just having better information on who is testifying and being able to look in a really standardized way at how that breaks down would be very helpful.
If I might just chime in here too a little bit, in a dream world, I could see, I think, first of all, once we get the data and the data visualizations of who has been testifying in Congress all these years, it will be shocking to see how narrow the perspectives have been on the record in the official sort of legislative history and memory of Congress. And the possibilities to create a far more diverse and representative and rich and interesting discourse through committees is really, I find, very hopeful and exciting. I do think that that there's a way possibly for communities out there around the country to organize themselves to be a little more adjacent to the rules and structures of the institution. So my dream, as someone, I used to work for the Progressive Caucus, and it was always like, how can we get progressives to be institutionalists? How can we get them to like maybe move on from the protest movements and actually become sort of closer to the functions of the legislature, which again, it's this couple 100-year-old organization. A lot of the committee jurisdictions don't make any sense. A lot of the rules don't make any sense. Like we can change these over time, but the truth is that there are real ways to get things done in Congress, and that the technology and transparency, simply the machine readability of Congress at this point is huge compared to 10 years ago. I put the docs.house.gov up, which is a committee repository inside Congress, which has all witness testimony in one place. It's kind of amazing. Even the data inside witness testimony, if you look at the number of subcommittees that happen every day, is tremendous information. I wish it was produced like television shows. Sometimes I think there's a way to produce that information that it's far more interesting. I spent a year out in the Four Corners region of New Mexico, where I'm from, over the pandemic, and 2 people I ran into in Aztec, New Mexico, which is 6,000 people, had testified in front of subcommittees, one on Navajo education and remote learning, and one on capping methane wells, orphan wells and the oil and gas industry on public lands. So like, there's just an example for me randomly being at home for 12 months that the communities around the country too, if they care to educate themselves about being far more effective in Congress, would be to create like mock witness panels, organizations and topics of hearings, get into the weeds of what the oversight plans are on these committees and try to bring information to the members in a way that they can actually metabolize it in the system that they're in. Does that make sense? I find it incredibly exciting, but it is quite nerdy. It's not nearly as much fun as like organizing on the mall and having signs carrying them down Pennsylvania Avenue, but we really have to get there.
I don't see any new questions in the chat other than one that Marcy just answered with recommendations. I do have a question about who does not modernizing Congress benefit? It's very clear that the modernization of Congress has tremendous benefits across the board, but simplifying the question, why is it so hard to modernize, other than the questions that have already been posed? And why is it so easy to organize things like the storm in the Capitol on January 6th, which we didn't quite talk about? How can we mobilize people to also pressure Congress to modernize itself in effective ways that are more inclusive and avoid things like violence and threats to democracy?
My sense right now is that there's a lot of people out around the country that we're not seeing right now, that we're seeing the loud people and the angry people. It's similar to like traditional town hall meetings where the member shows up and like 4 people ask all the questions and they keep that's a problem, and it's a distortion. I don't think that like middle of the road types who sort of want to see a problem solved or who could bring in an issue and would be glad to be involved in discourse and deliberation, I don't think they're organized quite yet in a way that is as impactful and to the extent that it could create an incentive and an alignment with the institution for who you elect to Congress. Like, I'd love to see a scorecard of members who are like just helping the institution do its job better and deliver and work. Right now, the incentives, and part of this is the nationalization of the news and the disinformation that's out there, is that a dream to me would be to take all of the sort of newly machine readable aspects of what members are doing. So members of Congress and Congress itself can become a participant in providing community information in new forms of civic journalism at the local level. I mean, there's ways to do that, and that would scale it up so that, for example, as Marcy talked about, this member-directed spending, it has real rules around it for transparency and accountability. You know, no relatives or private companies can be recipients of this information. There's this huge potential right there to report on a community activity that the people themselves are the ones who are creating the information for the story. To me, that's just an amazing opportunity for civic information and community journalism. I don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but I think the next step might be to start piloting those kinds of collaborations. I don't even know what to call it. They're not really partnerships, but the transparency of Congress, like it is huge now compared to a decade ago. But what we do with that information, is it going to help us align and create new incentives for the people we elect so that they're not, you know, calling in death threats on their colleagues on the infrastructure vote? It's huge. Like, that has to be part of this, that you can have 6 members in there making it impossible to do anything for everyone else, including in their own party. We have to present an alternative to that. They aren't the majority.
Absolutely. LaShonda or Marcy?
Yeah, I would say it is a tremendous question, and I always think about these modernization and institutional issues. They're so fundamental, but they're also luxury questions. You can worry about technology when you're not worried about your safety, or, you know, it's really tough right now to have the mundane conversation about technology and capacity and, you know, other things when there are so many questions that feel quite existential. I think that there's a circle so that Congress working better and listening to people better and sharing better information and being more transparent and being, you know, clearer in what it's doing helps people feel better about their government and trust its institutions better. And right now we're seeing really a perversion of that, and as Lorelei mentioned, this disinformation that fuels mistrust. So I do think that some of the communications and institutional and technical pieces are essential to rebuilding trust and transparency and helping people feel that they have a voice. But it's a really hard argument to make right now, just because the stakes feel so and are so high. So I think those of us, you know, I stay out of the electoral side of things, and I just kind of stay in my nerd box of kind of technocratic stuff. And you know, I feel like that's where my contribution can be, and others who are in this space kind of one foot in front of the other doing that piece, while others who have the passion and the expertise in other areas are working on, quite frankly, the bigger questions.
Absolutely. Lashonda, would you like to add to this? Okay. I have one more question. So we're about 12 minutes away from closing. So we have time for one more if there's anybody in the room that would like to ask it live or drop it in the chat. But the question is, we have a few people in the room that work with legislature in other countries. And although Congress is very unique as an institution, are there any transferable takeaways from the last few years of reforms that you think might benefit other countries?
I would ask the audience that question for us. Actually, I'd love to have best practices. I have to say, in working in and around Congress for the last 20 years, and I worked on foreign policy and national security before I became a Congress nerd, members of Congress are more interested in what the rest of the world is doing, what functioning democracies are doing to be successful right now than I've ever seen them. There's really some interesting entree points to, like, the House Democracy Partnership. People listening in other countries might know about International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute. To be completely honest, like, we need one of those for us right now. We need a National Democratic Institute for the United States. Like, we're a developing country right now when it comes to fragile institutions or brittle institutions. I think that, you know, the Summit on Democracy a few weeks ago, I thought almost completely missed that point. It was that it's hard for Americans to go from seeing themselves as the scheme of things to seeing themselves in the scheme of things. We are in that transition right now. And there are a lot of people, I think, for many years who have wanted so badly to share, but there's this sort of wall of American exceptionalism that's made it really hard. I think that wall is coming down, and that to the extent that, you know, if you work with members, invitations to directly to peers in Congress, creating an incentive for bipartisanship by inviting bipartisan delegations of members to meet with you, like anything anybody in the rest of the world can do to help these members be in the room together as colleagues and not as antagonists. Television shows, simply getting it out there, a different model of getting along and moving forward, or reestablishing a shared vision of the future. So I'm just going to flip that question on its head and ask you for help with that. For the United States right now, like, we're in trouble. Like, we haven't been in this dire straits for a long time, or certainly not in a modern way. And so we really need that encouragement and those different kind of models, and others taking the initiative too. Thank you.
Yeah. And I wanted to flag that we did a Defending Democracy program a while back that we're still building on, and there's this very rich exchange of learning from each other on what it means to both overcome crisis, but also address things in positive ways and have very innovative reforms in those regards. And I think with COVID, especially, just to bring it back to a part of the initial description of the event, is that this is a unifying crisis, not just for the US, but also for everyone around the world, and how we address it as far as policies and implementation and service delivery, and hearing people out who are suffering is extremely important. So if there's anyone in the audience that would like to add to that, please do let us know, speak up. And just to close us out soon, if there's anything else from the discussants that they would like to add before we go to takeaways, please go ahead.
Yeah, and this is Netta. I'll chime back in. I had to switch to my mobile phone, but yeah, I'd also just love to hear from the three speakers before we close, like if there are any specific actions that you would recommend that we take as people who may, try to be kind of informed citizens and so on. So would love to hear a round of closing, top ideas or actions that you think are important for us to take to support this institutional reform process.
Thank you. And I'm just going to ask Kathleen to speak up. She has her hand raised.
Hi there. My name is Kathleen Sherman. I work with the International Republican Institute. This has been a really interesting conversation. And actually, going to the last speaker's point, what I was thinking in the background of my head, I'm more encouraged after this conversation on what we can do on the technical side here in the U.S. specifically, but lessons for abroad as well. I guess my question for the panelists would be, and maybe this is a bit out of your realm, but with our current political party system, the way it is, and some of those incentive structures that you touched upon, I think that's my worrying concern for democracy here in the U.S. is how to overcome those structural issues that exist due to the way that our parties are organized, our parties are incentivized to act a certain way. And then when they get into Congress, it's just become an extension, in my view, a lot of times of then those party incentives rather than the incentive to really govern and do what the citizens want them to do. So if there's any comments on that, though, again, I actually feel more encouraged after this conversation on what we can do on the technical side.
I'm happy to jump in on that. And Kathleen, and again, waving the flag for IRI and NDI. You guys are amazing. I share Lorelai's wish that you were able to operate in the US because there's so many lessons that you have to share. And we've certainly drawn lots of inspiration over the years from your work and webinars and reports and things like that. And I agree. I think that the political structure of the US, specifically the geographic representation system, social media and the internet have exacerbated some incentives there that I think the founders never imagined. So the way that an individual lawmaker being extreme or shocking or in some way, however they do it, building a huge audience outside of their constituency on issues that are not particularly locally relevant and raising tons of money on it is a really, really bad incentive structure for lots of reasons. And it is really exacerbated now. It's something that I think you see less of in parliamentary systems. And so kind of back to the learning from other countries, I think sometimes there are lessons in deliberative democracy or engagement, things like that, that are really hard to translate to the US system just because of this like individual piece. I sometimes talk to folks who are very optimistic on the public engagement side about how constituents engage their members, and especially with the way laws are being made in Congress right now with the really, really top-down leadership-led structure of passing like 3 big bills a year, maybe. You convince one member, you've convinced one member. Like that is not as big a deal as it used to be, and especially with the kind of the committees not having as much power as they used to. So I think it's a really, really important question. And where I see hope is in some of these participatory mechanisms, because I think, committees are kind of feeling that. They're like, hey, what use is it to be a committee chair or ranking member if all of the bills are going to get hammered out in leadership anyway, and in a ping pong between the House and Senate. They can't just demand to get that authority back, but if they engaged in more public outreach and actually helped the public, especially impacted communities in their jurisdiction, know what's going on, know what's being discussed, and build support for what they're working on within the committees, it's almost a way to begin to recapture some of the authority that has kind of gone to leadership. The committees need the people, and the committees in the past have not engaged with the people. They've kind of left that to individual member offices. So I think there's a real opportunity. It would be a totally different approach from these congressional committees. I think natural resources has really led in that area, but for committees to start doing more public engagement, more public outreach, more in-district hearings, I think that's a potential way to see some of these issues addressed.
We have 3 minutes left. So I will move to the takeaways and then have each speaker leave us with something that we should remember, just 1 or 2 things. So number 1, Congress has been technologically obsolete. The plummeting of legitimacy has been very visible, but COVID pushed it to adapt quickly. Number 2 is that while modernizing reforms is extremely difficult, it has been immensely bipartisan, and it's part of rebuilding legitimacy despite all the complexities that go with it. And number 3, we absolutely do need more participatory mechanisms for communities to speak up, to be more diverse, to have more access to the ways that policies are shaped, especially with more technology of how we use the data that we have, and possibly modernizing further with policy modeling, and the future of legislation looks more hopeful there. If there's anything I missed that we should be highlighting, I would now ask the speakers to give us one more nutshell of information before we close out.
I would just say that the first mover space that exists in this sort of civic participation area in Congress has never been more broad. Like, they're looking to implement now, and the way things implement and scale in Congress is a couple members get together and do something and then share that with everyone and share their lessons. So it's really an entrepreneurial moment, but it's also going to take the IRIs and other organizations out there to get the interest to actually do the organizing and start trying things out. Like, what would this mean for civic journalism? Like, what would it mean to start broadening a second track to the hearing process? And so people can get just comfortable using this technology and adapting it for this sort of old beast of an institution that we're doing the best we can, but it takes time. There's lots of stuff that can happen in the first mover space.
Absolutely. This has been an incredibly insightful conversation, and I want to thank our speakers, Laura Kelly, Marcy Harris, and LaShonda Brinson, for being here and sharing the insights firsthand. And a huge thanks to our audience for being here and tuning in. If you have any more questions, do contact us at info@opengovhub.org. And there will be more on our Twitter space for sure. And then just before you close out, there will be a very short survey just to get a snapshot of how you felt about this event and why you came and what you'd like to hear next. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and we'll be sure to share the recording soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.